Pompeii, the year 79. A workshop near the sea gate goes quiet in a single afternoon, and it is still there. Not ruined, not looted, stopped. Excavators opened a house on the Via Vesuvio and found sunken vats still sunk in the floor, jars still stacked where a hand had left them. And on more than one of those jars, pressed into the clay before it was fired, the same name. Umbricius Scaurus. He is not guessing at fame from beyond the grave. His name has been found stamped on vessels, not just in that house, but scattered around the western Mediterranean, as far as southern France, as far as Spain, on jars that once held a product most people alive today would describe, not kindly, as fermented fish guts. Pliny the Elder, writing while Scaurus's factory was still working, says something that should stop you cold. Scarcely any liquid, he writes, except perfume, has come to be valued more highly. Fish guts, priced like perfume. That is the whole video in one sentence. And we are going to spend the next 20 minutes finding out how a man built a fortune, a house, and a political dynasty out of something that smelled the way this one did. Okay, so you want to own a Roman garum factory. Let's set it up properly. In Pompeii, in the middle of the 1st century, and follow the fish from the boat to the jar to the name pressed into the clay. By the end, you will understand that the product was never really the sauce. It was the stamp. First, kill the word, because garum is doing far too much work in most people's heads. There was no single product called garum. There was a ladder. At the bottom sat alec, the coarse leftover paste scraped from the bottom of the vat after the good liquid had been drawn off. Cheap, common, the kind of thing a poor household could actually afford. Above that sat liquamen, a thinner, more ordinary pressed sauce that shows up constantly in cookbooks and ration lists, the everyday seasoning of the Roman kitchen. Above that sat garum proper, the clear, carefully drawn-off liquid, sold at real weight in price. And at the very top, named for its place of origin and treated as something closer to a luxury import than a condiment, sat garum sociorum, allied garum, made specifically from mackerel at Carthago Nova on the Spanish coast. The tier Pliny is talking about when he reaches for perfume as the comparison. One fish, one process more or less. 4 names, 4 price points, and most modern retellings of this trade collapse all 4 into one word and lose the entire business in the process. And while we're correcting the picture in your head, let go of the other assumption people bring to this topic, that garum was some shameful, universally disgusting substance the Romans quietly tolerated and modern audiences love to be scandalized by. It wasn't a novelty condiment or a dare. It was closer to what soy sauce or fish sauce is in several living cuisines today, an everyday source of savory depth that turns up in recipe after recipe in the one Roman cookbook that survives in any real volume. The reaction of disgust is a modern import, not a Roman one. Romans of every class ate this constantly and did not think twice about it. What they did think about, carefully, was which grade of it they were eating and what name was on the jar. Now the workshop, because the layout tells you what kind of business this actually was before a single sale happens. You need waterfront, first of all, and not just any waterfront. You need it close enough to a fishing fleet that mackerel and sardine and anchovy reach you within hours of coming out of the water, because the whole process depends on starting with fish that has not begun to spoil on its own terms yet. You are not preserving decay. You are staging a controlled one, and controlled means fast. You need vats, and this is where the real capital sits. Not barrels, sunken masonry tanks, dolia, built down into the ground and lined, arranged in rows, each one large enough to hold a serious volume of fish and salt in alternating layers. This is not equipment you buy and carry home. It is construction, the same way a Roman bathhouse's hypocaust was construction rather than furniture, and it commits your property to one use for as long as you own it. You need salt, and you need a great deal of it, because the ratio of salt to fish is not a seasoning ratio, it is a preservation ratio. Salt is doing the chemical work that keeps the batch from simply rotting instead of fermenting. Salt in the Roman world was itself a taxed, sometimes state-controlled commodity, so before you have sold a single jar you are already a customer of the government's own salt administration, in whatever form it took in your province and your decade. You need sun, which costs nothing and is nonetheless a genuine input. The layered fish and salt sit exposed, stirred periodically, breaking down under heat and their own enzymes over weeks, sometimes longer depending on the fish and the season. No sun, no product. A workshop under permanent cloud is a workshop that does not work. Stand in that yard on the morning a batch is turned. A worker walks the row of open tanks with a long paddle, breaking the crust that forms on top of each one overnight, and the smell that comes up when the crust breaks is worse than the steady background reek the street has already learned to live with. Gulls circle low over the open tanks. Nobody hurries this part, because hurrying it wrong wastes weeks of salt and fish in a single afternoon, and there is no supplier who will take a ruined batch back. And you need jars. Amphorae and smaller urcei, made or bought in quantity from a potter you either own or contract with directly, because a liquid product with a market beyond your own street has to travel in something, and that something has to survive a cart, a ship's hold, and a buyer's inspection with the seal unbroken. The jar is not packaging in the modern sense. It is the last thing your customer sees before he decides whether to trust what's inside it, which means the mark stamped into its shoulder before firing is doing commercial work long before anyone tastes a drop. Add it up honestly, and this is not a cheap trade to enter. Fixed masonry tanks, a steady supply of fresh fish, bulk salt, and a standing order for ceramics before your first batch has even finished fermenting. This is infrastructure wearing a fisherman's apron. Now stand over the vats, because the smell is not a footnote, it is the reason half of this business's real estate decisions get made for it. Picture the yard at the height of a batch, rows of open vats under a hot sky, fish and salt worked down over weeks into something thick and pungent, flies working the rim of every tank, and a smell that does not stay politely inside your property line. Roman law recognized nuisance from exactly this kind of trade. Noxious smoke, noisy hammering, foul smells from processing businesses were all matters a neighbor could bring before a magistrate. The same legal territory this channel has already walked through with a London armorer's furious neighbors. A garum work sitting next to a respectable household was a lawsuit waiting for a bad week. Which is why these workshops cluster at the edge of things, near the sea gate rather than the forum, on streets given over to trades nobody wanted upwind of their dinner. Location was never a marketing decision here. It was damage control, now the labor, and it is where the trade turns quietly brutal. Gutting, salting, layering, stirring, and eventually decanting a large batch of fish is heavy, foul, repetitive work, done for hours at a stretch in the heat that the process itself requires. Much of this labor across the Roman fish processing trade generally was performed by enslaved workers, and the sources that survive from this world are, as they almost always are, written by and about the owners rather than the men standing in the vats. We do not have a single name for anyone who actually worked Scaurus's tanks. Set that against what we do know. A single skilled overseer, a freedman perhaps, capable of judging when a batch had turned correctly and when to draw it off, was worth vastly more than the unskilled hands doing the salting. Call it a ladder running from the lowest laborer, whose entire job is lifting and layering, up through the overseer whose entire job is knowing, by smell and by eye alone, that today rather than tomorrow is the day to open the tap. If the least skilled hand in that yard is worth a bare subsistence wage, the man making that call is worth a multiple of it several times over. The exact figure is not something any surviving Roman source gives us for this specific trade, so treat the multiple as a shape rather than a number. The same caution this channel has given every wage ladder before this one. What is not in doubt is the direction. Judgment was worth far more than muscle, and the judgment left no name behind either way. That call, made correctly, batch after batch, across an entire working life, is the actual skill this trade is buying. It is invisible in every account that survives, because nobody thought a slave's palate was worth writing down. So far, this looks like an unpleasant, capital-heavy trade selling a cheap commodity at a thin margin, propped up by a workforce whose names the record never bothered to keep. Here is where it starts making somebody rich, and it is not where you'd expect. Climb the revenue the way we always do here, from the obvious to the one nobody prices correctly. The obvious line is the sauce itself, sold by the jar, at whatever grade you have produced. Real money, steady demand, because Roman cooking used this seasoning the way modern kitchens use salt itself. It went into nearly everything, from a soldier's ration to a senator's dinner. One rung up, the latter pays twice. A single batch of fish, worked correctly, throws off more than one product at more than one price. The clear liquid drawn from the top is your garum. The paste left behind is your alec, sold on to a poorer customer who could never have afforded the good stuff. Nothing in that vat goes to waste, and nothing in that vat sells at only one price. You are not running one product line. You are running a single input through a sorting mechanism that manufactures its own market segmentation for free. Higher still, the export trade. Garum Sociorum's premium price was not a local Pompeian fluke, it was a Mediterranean-wide reputation. and reputation travels in jars. A producer whose product was known and trusted in a port 300 miles away could sell into a market he had never personally visited, on the strength of what was written on the outside of the vessel rather than anything the buyer could taste before purchase. And now the top of the ladder, and it is the whole reason this video exists. Go back to that jar found in southern France, stamped with a name from a workshop in Pompeii. Nobody in Gaul had met Scaurus. Nobody in Gaul had watched his vats being filled. What they had was a name pressed into wet clay before firing, a name that had, by reputation, come to mean a particular standard of product, and they paid accordingly, for a promise they could not verify any more than an apothecary's customer could verify what was actually in the jar. That is not a condiment business, that is a branding operation running on top of a condiment business, and the branding is worth more than the fish, the salt, the vats, and the labor combined. Which brings us to the mechanism, and it is quieter than a contract clause, closer to the way a beer house slowly pushed brewers without capital out of their own trade. Nobody had to license this. There was no guild seal, no royal charter, no formal monopoly stamped onto the right to sell fish sauce under your own name. What controlled who could compete at the top of this ladder was simpler and harder to fight. Waterfront property close enough to the fleet, capital enough to build sunken masonry tanks rather than rent someone else's, and a name already trusted enough in enough ports that a buyer 300 miles away would pay the premium sight unseen. None of those three things could be bought quickly, and none of them could be faked. A newcomer could produce chemically identical sauce in a rented yard and sell it for a fraction of the price, because nobody outside his own street had ever heard of him. The barrier to entry was not a law. It was reputation with a multi-year head start, and reputation does not care how good this week's batch is. Compare that to every gated business this channel has already opened. A guild seat was a fee you paid once, to an authority that issued you a document. A Venetian glass license was a decree, enforceable, revocable, written down. What Scaurus was sitting on had none of that architecture and was, if anything, harder to dislodge, because there was no single office to petition and no single rule to change. You cannot legislate your way into 40 years of jars already circulating under somebody else's name. By now, this looks unstoppable. Real demand, a self-sorting product line, an export network, and a name that travels farther than the seller ever does. Here is what breaks it, in three ways, each worse than the last. The first threat is the batch itself. A vat left too long, salted wrong, or exposed to the wrong weather does not become a lesser product, it becomes nothing. Spoiled fish, not cheap fish sauce, and every batch is a fresh bet with the same ingredients and the same weather you cannot control. Unlike a smith who can reheat a bent piece of iron, there is no rescuing a fermentation gone wrong. You start again, at full cost, or you don't start again at all this season. The second threat is the one that should worry a branded producer more than anyone. The entire value of your stamp rests on a promise nobody downstream can check. A buyer 300 miles from your workshop cannot taste the jar before he pays for it, cannot walk out to your yard and watch the batch being turned, and cannot tell the difference between your product and a cheaper imitation stamped with a forged version of your own mark until the seal is already broken and the money has already changed hands. Pliny himself complains elsewhere about adulteration running through Roman goods more broadly, and a market built entirely on trust in an unopenable jar is a market where a single scandal does not cost you one sale. It costs you every sale that name was ever going to make again, in every port that had never met you and had only ever met the stamp. Rebuilding a reputation that took a generation to establish is not a project you can complete inside the lifetime of the man who broke it. The third threat did not care about either of those risks, because it was not commercial at all. In the year 79, Vesuvius erupted, and within a day the towns along that stretch of coast, Pompeii among them, were buried under ash and pumice deep enough to preserve a city rather than merely destroy one. The workshops on the Via Vesuvio went from a functioning business to an archaeological site in the space of an afternoon. Nobody drew off that last batch. Nobody sold that last stack of stamped jars. The fire that ends this trade did not come from a rival, a lawsuit, or a bad decision. It came from underneath the ground the whole business was built on, and no ledger anywhere could have priced that risk in advance. Let's settle it honestly, because no complete account book survives for any Roman garum operation, Scaurus is included, and I am not going to invent one the way plenty of channels covering this topic already have. What we can do instead is price the thing we can actually verify, the gap between the branded product and the unbranded one. Pliny's figure for garum sociorum. Call it roughly 500 denarii for a modest quantity. And I'll flag that ancient price citations like this one are widely reported rather than drawn from a surviving business ledger. Sits against ordinary, unstamped fish sauce, selling for a routine kitchen price any household could manage without blinking. The spread between those two numbers is not a spread in fish. It is a spread in trust, manufactured entirely by a name pressed into clay before it went into the kiln. Run a workshop at Scaurus's evident scale, enough production to be stamping jars for export rather than only for the street outside your door. And the branded top tier alone, sold at the premium his name commanded, could plausibly clear more in a good season than the entire unbranded output of a rival operating the identical process next door. Fish for fish, salt for salt, vat for vat. That is a reconstruction built from the price evidence and the archaeology, not a recovered set of accounts, and I want it labeled as exactly that. Against it, the sunken tanks that never stop needing repair, the salt bill, the fresh fish that has to be paid for whether that week's batch turns out well or badly, the jars fired in bulk whether the season sells through or not, the labor, and the year Vesuvius makes every column in the ledger irrelevant at once. One caution before we move to the verdict, because this is exactly the kind of claim that gets overstated. Scaurus is not a typical garum producer. He is the one whose name happened to survive in unusually rich archaeological detail. A house with his product in the floor mosaics, jars stamped and scattered across a continent, a family that climbed into civic office. Treat him as the best documented case rather than the average one, the same caution this channel gave the Cuxum Manor and the Angel Inn. Most workshops running this exact process left far less behind, which is itself the whole point of this video. A bad season here does not look like the bakery's thin margin or the blacksmith's missing wage. It looks like a batch gone wrong at full cost with nothing to sell, or a rumor of adulteration reaching a port before your own ship does. So who got rich and who didn't? Scaurus did. His name is stamped on vessels found hundreds of miles from where he worked. His house in Pompeii carries mosaics depicting his own product, urns labeled with his own name set into the floor for guests to walk past on their way to dinner. A man literally decorating his home with his own brand. And the family did not stay at the level of tradesmen. His son held civic office in the town, the kind of position that Roman social mobility offered to families whose money had climbed high enough and stayed clean enough to be respectable, or at least respectable enough not to matter anymore. Set against him, everyone else who worked this trade, and there were a great many workshops doing more or less the same thing, up and down that coast, from the same fish, the same salt flats, the same basic construction of sunken tanks that any coastal town with money and a fleet could have commissioned. We do not have their names. We do not have their houses. We do not have jars from their vats turning up admired 300 miles away, because nobody far from home ever had a reason to remember a name they had never heard in the first place. That is the whole verdict in one comparison. One man's name survives in the archaeological record because he made sure it was pressed into every single jar he sold, and it worked so well that we are still reading it 2,000 years later. Everyone who sold the identical product without doing that is simply gone, indistinguishable now from the fish they processed. So, could you get rich owning a Roman garum factory? Not from the fish. The fish was never scarce, the process was never secret, and any coastal town with a fleet and some salt could produce a passable version of the same sauce. The men who got rich sold something the fish could never provide on its own, a name a stranger in a port he'd never visit was willing to trust before he'd broken the seal. They controlled the waterfront, they controlled the capital for the tanks, and they controlled the one thing that could never be copied overnight, which was how long their name had already been circulating before anyone else's. Go back to that house on the Via Vesuvio, sealed under ash for 18 centuries, opened again with the vats still sunk in the floor and the jars still stacked where a hand had left them. Nobody remembers the fish. Nobody could, even if they wanted to. It turned to nothing the moment the process that made it valuable stopped being maintained. What survived, pressed into fired clay, sitting in museum cases from Pompeii to the south of France, is a name. Nobody ever paid for the sauce. They paid for the stamp pressed into the jar it came in, and the stamp is the only part of this business that outlived the man who owned it.